A fierce lynx spotted a woman by the riverbank, but what happened next left everyone speechless. The crisp Montana morning air carried the scent of pine needles as Margaret Walker stepped onto her cabin's wooden porch. At 65, her silver hair caught the early sunlight and her weathered hands clutched a steaming cup of coffee. The majestic Rocky Mountains loomed before her, their peaks shrouded in morning mist, offering both solace and challenge to her searching soul. If this story captured your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. Let us know which city you're watching from. Stay tuned. 6 months had passed since Henry's departure, and the silence in their mountain home remained deafening. Every corner held memories of their shared life. The creaking rocking chair where he'd read his beloved Western novels, the carved walking stick he'd made during their first year in Bozeman, the collection of bird feeders he'd meticulously maintained. Now the feeders hung empty, much like the space in her heart. Margaret had spent 30 years teaching literature at Bozeman High School, inspiring generations of students to find meaning in words. But now, no amount of poetry could capture the depth of her loneliness. The community had been kind, almost too kind, with their casseroles and sympathetic smiles, but their well-meaning presence only emphasized Henry's absence. That morning, something felt different. Perhaps it was the way the sun painted the mountains in shades of amber and gold, or maybe it was the persistent call of a mountain chickadee that refused to be ignored. Whatever the reason, Margaret found herself drawn to the hiking backpack, gathering dust in the mudroom. "Time to stop hiding," she whispered to herself, running her fingers along the worn straps. Henry had always encouraged her to embrace adventure, even when she preferred the safety of their porch. "The mountains won't climb themselves, Maggie," he'd say with that gentle smile that could melt glaciers. Within an hour, Margaret had signed up for a guided hiking expedition with Mountain Trails Adventures. The group specialized in helping seniors reconnect with nature, and their experienced guide, Ethan Cooper, came highly recommended. The idea of joining strangers on a wilderness journey both terrified and excited her, exactly the kind of contradiction Henry would have appreciated. As she packed her gear, Margaret discovered an old journal tucked away in Henry's desk drawer. The leather-bound book contained detailed descriptions of local wildlife, particularly the elusive lynx population that once thrived in these mountains. Henry had been fascinated by these solitary creatures, their resilience and their ability to survive against all odds. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the meeting point, her heart thundering like a summer storm. Ethan, a rugged man in his 40s, with kind eyes and a salt and pepper beard, greeted the small group of hikers. Besides Margaret, there were 2 retired couples and a wildlife photographer, all seeking their own forms of healing or discovery in the wilderness. "Welcome to the Gallatin Range," Ethan announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who knew these mountains intimately. "Remember, we're guests here. The wildlife you might encounter, bears, moose, lynx, they're the true owners of this land. We respect their space. Follow their rules." As they began their ascent, Margaret felt her muscles protest against the unfamiliar exercise. But with each step, the weight of grief seemed to lighten slightly. The trail wound through stands of lodgepole pine and across meadows painted with wildflowers. The conversation among the group flowed easily, stories shared between breaths and water breaks. When they reached their first viewpoint, Margaret stood in awe of the valley below. The perspective made her feel both insignificant and part of something vastly greater than herself. A golden eagle soared overhead, its wingspan casting a fleeting shadow across their group. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Ethan appeared beside her, offering a granola bar. "The mountains have a way of putting things in perspective." Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. In that moment, surrounded by the raw beauty of the Rockies, she felt Henry's presence more strongly than she had in months. not as a shadow of loss, but as a gentle push towards something new. As the group continued their trek, Margaret found herself falling slightly behind, drawn to a crystal-clear stream that paralleled their path. The water's song spoke of secrets hidden in these mountains, of stories waiting to be discovered. Little did she know that this was just the beginning of an extraordinary journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about nature, connection, and healing. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mountain trail as the hiking group ventured deeper into the wilderness. Ethan led them along a well-worn path, occasionally stopping to point out native plants and animal tracks. Margaret found herself increasingly drawn to the untamed beauty surrounding them, her camera clicking steadily as she captured the dramatic landscape. "Everyone, gather around," Ethan called, his voice carrying a note of authority that drew the group's attention. "We're approaching a section of the trail that requires extra caution. Stay together, and whatever you do, don't wander off alone." His eyes lingered on Margaret, who had already demonstrated a tendency to lag behind the group, captivated by the smallest details of nature. The path narrowed as it wound alongside a rushing river, its waters crystal clear and frighteningly cold. The sound of the current filled the air, a constant reminder of nature's raw power. Margaret's attention was caught by something unusual. A small clearing just off the main trail, where the morning light created a perfect mirror on a calm pool of water. "Just imagine the photograph," she murmured to herself, watching as the surrounding peaks reflected perfectly in the water's surface. The rest of the group continued ahead, their voices growing fainter as they rounded a bend in the trail. Margaret glanced between them and the clearing, making a split-second decision that would change everything. Carefully, she stepped off the main path, her hiking boots crunching softly on the pine needles. The clearing was closer than it appeared, and the view was even more spectacular up close. The mountains seemed to float upside down in the water's surface, creating an otherworldly scene that begged to be captured. Margaret raised her camera, adjusting the settings to capture the perfect shot. She took one step closer to the water's edge, seeking the ideal angle. The rock beneath her foot appeared solid, its surface dusted with morning frost. But appearances in the wilderness could be deceiving. In an instant, everything changed. The seemingly stable rock shifted under her weight, slick with invisible ice. Margaret felt herself losing balance, her arms windmilling as she tried to regain her footing. The camera went flying, landing safely in a patch of moss, but Margaret wasn't as fortunate. The shock of the icy water stole her breath as she plunged into the river. The current, deceptively strong, immediately began pulling her downstream. Her winter jacket, now waterlogged, felt like it was made of lead. Margaret fought against the panic rising in her chest, remembering the water safety lessons she'd taught her students years ago. "Stay calm, float on your back, look for something to grab," she repeated to herself, her voice barely audible over the rushing water. But the river had other plans, carrying her further from the trail with each passing second. The cold was beginning to seep into her bones, making her movements sluggish and uncoordinated. Through water-blurred eyes, Margaret caught glimpses of the shoreline rushing past. She tried calling for help, but the sound of the river drowned out her voice. The rest of the hiking group was too far ahead to hear her struggle. Fear, real and primal, began to take hold as she realized the severity of her situation. Just as her strength was beginning to fail, something on the riverbank caught her attention. At first, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her, a result of the cold and fear. But there, standing on a rocky outcrop, was a sight that seemed impossible. A magnificent lynx, its tufted ears alert, and its eyes fixed intently on her struggling form. The animal's presence was both terrifying and mesmerizing, its muscular body tensed, and to Margaret's astonishment, it began moving along the shoreline, keeping pace with her as the current carried her downstream. There was an intelligence in its amber eyes that seemed to transcend normal animal behavior. Margaret's focus on the lynx was interrupted by another wave that pushed her under momentarily. When she surfaced, gasping for air, she saw the big cat had moved closer to the water's edge. Its behavior defied everything she'd ever learned about these solitary, shy creatures. The lynx's movements were deliberate, purposeful, as if it was assessing the situation. Through the numbing cold and fear, Margaret remembered Henry's journal entries about the local lynx population. He had always insisted these animals possessed an intelligence and awareness that humans had barely begun to understand. At the time, she had smiled indulgently at his enthusiasm. Now, as she locked eyes with this magnificent creature, she began to wonder if there was more truth to his words than she'd realized. The river bent sharply ahead, and Margaret could hear the roar of rapids growing louder. Her time was running out. The lynx seemed to sense the increasing danger, its powerful muscles coiling as it prepared for action. What happened next would challenge everything Margaret thought she knew about the natural world and the boundaries between humans and wild animals. Time seemed to stand still as Margaret watched the lynx move with calculated precision along the riverbank. The cold water had numbed her limbs, making each attempt to stay afloat increasingly difficult. The roar of the approaching rapids grew louder, a deadly reminder of her predicament. Without warning, the lynx leaped into the rushing water. Margaret's heart nearly stopped at the sight of the powerful creature swimming toward her with determined strokes. Everything she knew about wild animals, about survival, about the natural order of things, was being challenged in this moment. The big cat reached her just as another wave threatened to pull her under. With incredible gentleness, its powerful jaws gripped the collar of her jacket, careful not to hurt her. The lynx's strength was remarkable as it began guiding her toward the shoreline, fighting against the current with powerful strokes. Margaret felt her feet touch the rocky riverbed, and with the lynx's guidance, she managed to drag herself onto the bank. She collapsed onto the cold earth, coughing and shivering, her clothes heavy with river water. The lynx stood nearby, water dripping from its thick fur, its intense amber eyes fixed upon her with what seemed like concern. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, hardly believing the words were leaving her mouth. The animal's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it remained vigilant, as if ensuring she was truly safe. As her breathing steadied, Margaret studied her unlikely savior. The lynx was larger than she'd imagined, with distinctive black-tipped ears and a short, black-tipped tail. Its fur was a mixture of grey and brown, perfect camouflage for the rocky terrain. But it was the eyes that held her attention. They seemed to possess an almost human-like intelligence. Slowly, carefully, Margaret sat up, expecting the wild animal to bolt at any moment. But the lynx merely took a few steps back, maintaining a respectful distance while keeping her in its sight. This behavior was unprecedented. Lynx were known for their solitary nature and tendency to avoid human contact at all costs. The sound of distant voices broke the spell. "Margaret! Margaret, where are you?" Ethan's worried calls echoed through the trees. The lynx's ears perked up at the sound, and with one final penetrating look at Margaret, it melted into the forest undergrowth like a ghost. Minutes later, Ethan and two other hikers burst through the vegetation, their faces etched with concern. They found Margaret sitting on the riverbank, soaked and shivering, but alive. Their relief quickly turned to disbelief as she recounted what had happened. "A lynx pulled you from the river?" Ethan's skepticism was evident in his voice. "Margaret, are you sure? The cold water might have affected your perception. Lynx don't behave that way. They're solitary predators, not rescue animals." But Margaret knew what she had experienced. The memory of those intelligent eyes, the deliberate gentleness of the powerful creature, was burned into her mind. As the group helped her back to the trail, providing dry clothes and warm drinks from their packs, she couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary had occurred. That evening, back at the base camp, Margaret sat alone by the fire, wrapped in warm blankets. Her thoughts kept returning to the lynx and its inexplicable behavior. She remembered Henry's journal entries about these mysterious creatures, how he'd spent countless hours observing and documenting their habits. Had he known something about these animals that others had missed? The flames danced before her eyes as she recalled specific passages from Henry's writings. He had theorized about the complex social structures and intelligence of lynx, ideas that had been dismissed by other wildlife observers. Now, after her experience, those theories didn't seem so far-fetched. As darkness settled over the camp, Margaret noticed movement at the edge of the firelight. There, just visible in the shadows, sat the lynx. It was watching her again, its eyes reflecting the firelight like golden coins. None of the other campers seemed to notice its presence, but Margaret felt its gaze like a physical touch. The animal's return challenged everything the experts claimed about lynx behavior. This wasn't just a random encounter or a one-time act of unusual behavior. There was something more happening here, something that defied conventional explanation. That night, as Margaret lay in her tent listening to the wilderness sounds, she made a decision. She would extend her stay in the mountains, even if it meant joining another hiking group. There was a mystery here that needed unraveling, a connection that demanded exploration. Little did she know that her encounter with the lynx was just the beginning of a series of events that would challenge not only her understanding of nature, but also the beliefs of the entire local community. The following days brought a subtle shift in the mountain's rhythm. Margaret, having convinced Ethan to let her stay with the group, noticed small changes in their surroundings that others seemed to miss. The lynx's presence, though often invisible to the rest of the camp, became a constant in her daily routine. During morning hikes, she would catch glimpses of tawny fur moving through the undergrowth. The big cat never approached closely when others were present, but Margaret knew it was there, watching, following, protecting. She began carrying her camera everywhere, hoping to capture evidence of this extraordinary behavior, but the lynx proved too elusive for photographs. "You've developed quite an imagination, Margaret," Ethan commented one evening as they sat around the campfire. The other hikers had already retired to their tents, leaving them alone with the crackling flames. Lynx are notorious for avoiding human contact. They don't form attachments, especially not to people. Margaret sipped her tea thoughtfully before responding. "Then how do you explain what happened at the river?" she challenged. "I know what I experienced, Ethan." "This isn't just my imagination." Before Ethan could respond, a distinctive sound echoed through the darkness, a low, rumbling call that was neither quite a purr nor quite a growl. The lynx had never vocalized before, and the sound sent shivers down Margaret's spine. Ethan's eyes widened as he scanned the shadows beyond their camp. "That's unusual," he admitted, his skepticism wavering slightly. "I've never heard one so close to camp before." The next morning, Margaret ventured a little farther from the group during their daily hike, though still within sight of the others. She found herself in a small clearing where wildflowers painted the ground in vibrant purples and yellows. As she knelt to photograph a particularly beautiful columbine, she felt the familiar sensation of being watched. The lynx emerged from the tree line with silent grace, its powerful body moving like liquid gold in the morning light. This time, instead of maintaining its usual distance, it approached her slowly, deliberately. Margaret's heart raced, but she remained still, instinctively knowing this moment was important. The big cat stopped a few feet away, its intelligent eyes studying her with an intensity that took her breath away. Then, to her amazement, it sat down, wrapping its tail around its paws, in a gesture that seemed almost casual. The morning breeze ruffled its fur, revealing old scars beneath, testament to a life lived wild and free in these mountains. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Margaret whispered, noticing how the animal's ear twitched at the sound of her voice. Looking closer, she could see that one of the lynx's front paws was slightly favoring the ground, suggesting a recent injury. The moment was broken by voices approaching through the trees. The lynx disappeared as silently as it had arrived, leaving Margaret to wonder about the significance of this encounter. When she rejoined the group, she kept the experience to herself, knowing they wouldn't understand. That evening, as Margaret wrote in her journal about the day's events, she found herself remembering more details from Henry's research. He had documented cases of injured wildlife seeking out human presence, though never anything as dramatic as her current situation. The lynx's behavior seemed to transcend mere curiosity or opportunism. There was an intelligence behind its actions that suggested something deeper. A commotion outside her tent drew her attention. Two younger hikers who had joined the group that day were excitedly discussing tracks they'd found near the camp's perimeter. "They're huge," one of them exclaimed. "Much bigger than any lynx tracks I've ever seen." Margaret listened intently, her pen hovering above her journal. The wilderness seemed to be revealing its secrets to her gradually, like pages in a book, slowly turning. Each day brought new questions, new mysteries to unravel. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something more significant was unfolding, something that would challenge not just her understanding of nature, but the very boundaries between the wild and the civilized world. As night fell over the camp, distant storm clouds gathered on the horizon, their lightning-lit silhouettes promising changes to come. Margaret sat at the edge of camp, watching the approaching weather front with a mixture of anticipation and concern. She had learned enough about mountain weather to know that storms could be dangerous, but something about this one felt different. The lynx's behavior throughout the day had been more agitated than usual, as if it sensed something that the humans had yet to perceive. Little did Margaret know that the coming storm would bring more than just rain and thunder. It would set in motion a chain of events that would force her to confront not only the mysteries of the wilderness, but also the prejudices and fears of those who sought to control it. The bond between her and the lynx was about to be tested in ways neither of them could anticipate. The storm clouds loomed ever closer as night descended on the camp, their dark masses illuminated by occasional flashes of lightning. Margaret sat awake in her tent, listening to the increasing wind that made the canvas walls shudder. Something about this night felt different, charged with an energy that set her nerves on edge. A familiar sound caught her attention, the distinctive call of the lynx. But this time it seemed more urgent, almost distressed. Margaret unzipped her tent and peered out into the darkness. There, at the edge of the campsite, she could see the lynx's silhouette, its eyes reflecting the dim light of the dying campfire. The big cat's behavior was unusual. Instead of its typical calm demeanor, it paced back and forth, occasionally looking at her before moving a few steps away, then returning to repeat the pattern. Margaret had spent enough time observing the animal to recognize that something was wrong. "What is it?" she whispered, stepping out of her tent. The wind whipped at her jacket as she carefully approached the spot where the lynx waited. The animal's agitation only seemed to increase as she drew closer. Suddenly, the lynx darted a short distance away, then stopped and looked back at her expectantly. When Margaret didn't immediately follow, it returned and repeated the action. The meaning was clear. It wanted her to follow. Margaret's heart raced as she considered her options. Following a wild animal into the dark forest during an approaching storm went against every safety rule she'd ever learned. But something in the lynx's behavior, that unmistakable intelligence she'd come to recognize, told her this was important. She grabbed her flashlight and warm jacket, quickly scribbling a note for Ethan in case anyone noticed her absence. "Gone to check something. Will be careful. M." The lynx waited patiently as she prepared, its tail twitching with barely contained urgency. As they moved away from camp, The wind grew stronger, bending the tops of the pine trees and creating an eerie whistling sound through the branches. The lynx led her along a path she hadn't noticed before, occasionally pausing to ensure she was keeping up. They climbed higher into the mountains, the terrain becoming increasingly steep and rocky. Margaret's legs burned with the effort, but the lynx's obvious distress drove her forward. After about 20 minutes of climbing, they reached a vantage point that overlooked the valley where their camp was situated. The lynx stopped, turning its penetrating gaze toward the mountainside above their camp. Margaret followed its line of sight, using her flashlight to illuminate the slope. At first, she saw nothing unusual, but then a detail caught her attention, a network of thin cracks in the rock face, barely visible in the beam of her light. A powerful gust of wind brought with it the first heavy drops of rain, and Margaret watched in horror as water began seeping into those cracks. Years of teaching geology to her students came rushing back, water penetrating rock fissures, freezing and thawing cycles, weakening the structure, all culminating in, "The slope is unstable," she breathed, understanding dawning with terrifying clarity. The lynx's urgent behavior suddenly made perfect sense. With the incoming storm and the amount of rainfall it promised, those weakened rocks could give way at any moment, sending a devastating landslide directly toward their camp. The lynx growled softly, as if confirming her fears. Margaret didn't waste another moment. She turned and began scrambling back down the path, her heart pounding with the urgency of their situation. The big cat matched her pace, occasionally guiding her around obstacles in the growing darkness. The wind had reached fierce proportions by the time they neared the camp, driving the rain horizontally and making it difficult to see. Margaret could hear voices raised in concern. The others were awake now, probably worried about the storm's intensity. As she burst into the campsite, Ethan was already organizing the group, having recognized the dangerous weather conditions. "Margaret, where have you been? We need to—" he began, but she cut him off. "We have to evacuate immediately," she shouted over the wind. "The slope above us is compromised. There's going to be a landslide." Ethan's expression shifted from surprise to concern as he processed her words. Years of mountain experience had taught him to trust warnings about natural dangers, regardless of their source. Without hesitation, he began issuing rapid evacuation orders to the group. As the camp erupted into urgent activity, Margaret noticed the lynx watching from the shadows, its presence undetected by the others in their rush to pack essential items. Those intelligent eyes met hers once again, and in that moment she understood that this extraordinary animal had just saved not only her life, but the lives of everyone in the camp. The night was far from over, and as the storm intensified, Margaret knew their ordeal was just beginning. The bond between her and the lynx had grown stronger, but the true test of their connection and the challenges they would face together still lay ahead in the darkness of this tempestuous mountain night. The evacuation of the camp happened just in time. As the group hurried down the mountain through the driving rain, a deep rumble echoed through the valley. Margaret turned to see a portion of the slope give way, rocks and debris cascading down exactly where their tents had stood minutes before. The lynx's warning had saved them all. In the valley below, they found shelter in an emergency ranger station. As the others huddled inside, sharing hot drinks and processing their narrow escape, Margaret stood at the window, watching the storm rage outside. The lynx was nowhere to be seen, but she felt certain it was safe, having demonstrated an uncanny understanding of the mountain's dangers. "I owe you an apology," Ethan said, joining her at the window. His voice was quiet, meant only for her ears. "When you first told us about the lynx saving you from the river, I didn't believe you. But after tonight—" He shook his head in wonder. "How did you know about the landslide?" Margaret hesitated, knowing how incredible the truth would sound. "The lynx showed me," she finally replied, meeting his skeptical gaze. It led me to a spot where I could see the cracks in the rock face. It knew Ethan. It understood the danger and wanted to warn us. To her surprise, Ethan didn't immediately dismiss her explanation. Instead, he pulled out a worn notebook from his pack. "There's something you should see," he said, flipping through the pages. "Over the years, I've heard stories from local tribes about special relationships between people and mountain animals. I always thought they were just legends. But now..." He showed her a page filled with neat handwriting and rough sketches. The notes detailed accounts of various animals displaying unusual behavior: wolves leading lost hikers to safety, eagles warning of approaching storms, and, most intriguingly, a lynx that had repeatedly appeared to protect a family during a particularly harsh winter. "These accounts span decades," Ethan explained. "Most scientists dismiss them as folklore, but the consistency of the stories, the specific details..." He paused, looking out at the storm-swept landscape. "Maybe there's more to these mountains and their inhabitants than we understand." The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the storm having washed the air clean. The group emerged from the ranger station to survey the damage. Their original campsite was buried under rock and mud, a sobering reminder of what could have happened if they hadn't evacuated in time. As the others discussed plans to return to civilization, Margaret felt drawn to explore the area around the station. In the morning light, she discovered fresh lynx tracks in the mud. Her companion had stayed close throughout the night, watching over them. Following the tracks led her to a small clearing where the morning sun created a natural spotlight through the trees. There, to her amazement, she found the lynx waiting, but this time something was different. The animal was limping more noticeably, its injury apparently worsened by the previous night's activities. "You're hurt," Margaret said softly, taking a careful step forward. The lynx didn't retreat, instead settling down in the grass, its posture suggesting both pain and trust. It was a pivotal moment. The wild creature was showing vulnerability, choosing to seek help rather than hide its weakness. Margaret slowly reached into her pack and retrieved her first aid kit. Her years of hiking had taught her basic animal care, though she'd never imagined using these skills on a lynx. To her astonishment, the animal remained still as she approached, its intelligent eyes watching her every move. The wound on its paw wasn't severe, a deep cut that needed cleaning and protection. With gentle movements and soothing words, Margaret managed to clean and bandage the injury. The lynx accepted her ministrations with remarkable patience, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed almost like purring. As she worked, Margaret noticed other scars on the animal's body, telling a story of survival in these harsh mountains. Some appeared old, while others were more recent. She couldn't help but wonder what battles this magnificent creature had fought, what challenges it had overcome. The sound of approaching footsteps caused the lynx to tense, but it didn't immediately flee. Ethan emerged from the trees, stopping in his tracks at the sight before him. His expression shifted from concern to wonder as he witnessed the incredible scene. A wild lynx allowing human care. "This changes everything," he whispered, careful not to disturb the moment. "The scientific community needs to know about this. It challenges everything we thought we knew about wildlife behavior." But as Margaret finished bandaging the lynx's paw, she felt a growing sense of unease about Ethan's words. Publicity could bring unwanted attention to these mountains and their extraordinary inhabitants. She remembered Henry's careful documentation of the lynx population, how he had chosen to keep some of his most remarkable observations private to protect these magnificent creatures. The lynx seemed to share her concern, rising gracefully despite its injury and moving toward the forest edge. Before disappearing into the undergrowth, it turned to look at Margaret one final time, its gaze conveying something that went beyond mere animal instinct. This was a connection that transcended the natural order, a bond that would soon be tested in ways neither of them could imagine. The news of the extraordinary lynx spread through the local community like wildfire, despite Margaret's attempts to keep the story private. Ethan's enthusiasm had led him to share their experiences with other guides and rangers, and soon the ranger station became a hub of curious visitors and skeptical wildlife experts. Margaret watched with growing concern as more people began venturing into the area, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the remarkable creature. She had relocated to a small cabin near the ranger station, unable to bring herself to leave the mountains. Each morning, she would scan the tree line for signs of her feline friend, worried about the increasing human presence in its territory. One crisp morning, while following a familiar trail, Margaret discovered something that made her blood run cold. Hidden among the undergrowth was a steel trap, its jaws ready to snap shut on any unsuspecting animal that triggered it. Her hands trembled as she carefully marked the location, knowing she needed to alert the authorities. "These traps are illegal in protected areas," Ranger Sarah Collins explained when Margaret reported her discovery. The young ranger's face was creased with worry as she documented the location. "But we've been finding more of them lately. Someone's been systematically placing them throughout the region." As they continued their inspection of the area, they found more traps hidden along game trails. Margaret couldn't shake the image of the lynx, with its recently healed paw, stumbling into one of these cruel devices. The thought made her physically ill. "Who would do this?" Margaret asked, watching as Sarah carefully disabled another trap. "These mountains are supposed to be a sanctuary." Sarah's expression darkened. "There's been some tension lately. A few local hunters believe the lynx population is affecting the game population. But this," she gestured to the traps, "this is crossing a line." Back at her cabin that evening, Margaret pored over Henry's journal entries about the local wildlife. His detailed observations painted a picture of a delicate ecosystem where each species played a vital role. The lynx weren't a threat, they were essential to maintaining the balance of the mountain environment. A soft sound outside her window caught her attention. The lynx had appeared, as if summoned by her thoughts. But something was different tonight. The animal seemed agitated, moving restlessly back and forth in the shadows. Margaret grabbed her jacket and stepped outside. The big cat led her to a clearing not far from her cabin. There, in the fading light, Margaret saw what had disturbed her friend. A group of younger lynx, barely more than cubs, were playing near a fallen log. Their mother watched vigilantly from nearby, unexpectedly tolerant of Margaret's presence. Understanding dawned on Margaret as she watched the scene. This wasn't just about one remarkable lynx. This was about protecting an entire family, a new generation of these magnificent creatures. Her companion wasn't just an isolated case of unusual behavior. It was part of a complex social structure that humans had barely begun to understand. The sound of a vehicle on the nearby forest road caused the lynx family to disappear into the undergrowth. Margaret recognized the approaching truck. It belonged to Jack Miller, a local hunter known for his strong opinions about predator control. He slowed as he passed her cabin, his gaze lingering too long for comfort. Inside her cabin, Margaret made a decision. She began organizing Henry's research notes, combined with her own observations and photographs. The story needed to be told, but it needed to be told right. These weren't just animals to be controlled or eliminated. They were intelligent beings capable of compassion, family bonds, and remarkable relationships with humans. As she worked late into the night, she could hear the lynx's distinctive call in the distance. It was a reminder of the trust that had been placed in her and the responsibility that came with it. The mountains held secrets that needed protection, and Margaret was beginning to understand that she had been chosen as their guardian. But the growing tension in the community couldn't be ignored. More people were taking sides, those who viewed the lynx as a threat to be eliminated and those who saw the value in protecting these extraordinary creatures. Margaret knew that soon she would have to step forward and share what she had learned, even if it meant facing opposition from those who refused to understand. The lynx appeared at her window one last time that night, its golden eyes reflecting the lamplight from within. In that moment, Margaret realized that her journey in these mountains had become something far greater than her personal healing. She had become part of a story that would challenge not just local attitudes, but the very way humans understood their relationship with the natural world. The following days brought an uneasy tension to the mountain community. Margaret noticed increased traffic on the normally quiet forest roads, trucks carrying hunting gear, self-proclaimed wildlife experts with their equipment, and curious onlookers hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous lynx. The peaceful sanctuary she had found was slowly transforming into a circus. During her morning hike, Margaret met Dr. James Wilson, a wildlife biologist who had traveled from the University of Montana to investigate the reports. Unlike the other newcomers, he approached the situation with genuine scientific curiosity rather than skepticism or hostility. "These behavioral patterns you've described are extraordinary," Dr. Wilson said as they walked along the trail. "If documented properly, it could revolutionize our understanding of wild feline cognition and social behavior." Margaret shared some of her observations, but kept the most remarkable details to herself. She had become protective of the lynx family's secrets, especially after noticing more unauthorized traps in the area. Despite reporting them to Ranger Sarah, new ones seemed to appear regularly. "The local ecosystem is delicate," Dr. Wilson continued, stopping to examine some fresh lynx tracks. "These animals play a crucial role in maintaining the balance. The problem is, not everyone sees it that way." As if to emphasize his point, they heard the sound of approaching ATVs. Jack Miller and two other men emerged from a side trail, their vehicles loaded with hunting gear. They stopped when they saw Margaret and the biologist. "More city folks coming to tell us how to manage our mountains?" Jack called out, his tone confrontational. "These predators are destroying our hunting grounds, but nobody wants to hear about that." Margaret stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "These mountains belong to all of us, Jack. The lynx have as much right to be here as we do. They're not the threat you think they are." Jack's expression hardened. "You've been spending too much time with that creature, Margaret. It's not natural. Wild animals should stay wild, and if they don't..." He left the threat hanging in the air as they drove away. That evening, Margaret sat on her cabin porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The lynx appeared silently, as it often did, but this time it wasn't alone. The mother lynx and her cubs were with it, staying at the edge of the forest, but clearly visible. Dr. Wilson, who had been preparing to leave, froze in amazement at the sight. "Incredible," he whispered, reaching slowly for his camera. "This level of trust, it's unprecedented." The family of lynx seemed to be putting on a display of their natural behavior, almost as if they understood the importance of the moment. The cubs played and wrestled while their mother watched attentively. Margaret's companion sat regally, its intelligent eyes moving between the humans and its family. "They want us to understand them," Margaret said softly. "They're showing us who they really are." Dr. Wilson nodded, his scientific skepticism visibly wavering. "This could change everything. Our understanding of wildlife behavior, conservation approaches, the way we interact with nature itself." But their moment of wonder was interrupted by the distant sound of gunshots. The lynx family disappeared instantly into the forest, leaving Margaret and Dr. Wilson standing in the growing darkness, their hearts heavy with concern. Later that night, unable to sleep, Margaret returned to Henry's journals. His detailed observations of the lynx population now seemed prophetic. He had documented similar instances of extraordinary behavior but had chosen to keep them private, understanding that some mysteries of nature needed protection from those who would exploit them. A soft scratching at her door drew her attention. Opening it carefully, she found her lynx companion waiting. Something about its posture suggested urgency. Following it into the moonlit forest, Margaret discovered why. More traps had been laid, this time dangerously close to the area where the cubs played. Working carefully in the dim light, Margaret began disabling the traps. The lynx watched nearby, occasionally making soft vocalizations that seemed almost like words of encouragement. As she worked, Margaret realized that the battle for these mountains was about more than just protecting one remarkable animal. It was about preserving a deeper truth about the relationship between humans and wildlife. The moon was high overhead when she finished, casting silver light through the pine branches. The lynx accompanied her back to her cabin, staying closer than usual, as if sensing her need for companionship. As they walked, Margaret could feel the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She knew that soon she would have to take a stand, to speak for these creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. But for now, in the quiet of the mountain night, she found strength in the extraordinary bond she shared with this wild creature. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was no longer alone in facing them. The lynx had chosen her as its ally, and together they would protect the delicate balance of life in these ancient mountains. Dawn broke over the mountains with an unusual stillness. Margaret sat at her cabin's small desk, surrounded by papers, Henry's journals, her own notes, and Dr. Wilson's preliminary research findings. The scientific community was beginning to take notice of the extraordinary events unfolding in these mountains. But with attention came increased risk. A gentle tapping at her window announced the lynx's arrival. Over the weeks, it had developed a routine of morning visits, often bringing small gifts, a pine cone, a colorful feather, once even a perfectly preserved butterfly wing. Today, however, its behavior was different. The animal paced anxiously, looking back toward the forest repeatedly. "What is it?" Margaret asked, grabbing her jacket. The lynx's agitation was contagious, and she had learned to trust its instincts. Following the creature into the forest, she noticed something alarming. The usual morning sounds of birds and small animals were absent, replaced by an unnatural silence. They reached a clearing where Margaret had often observed the lynx family. The sight that greeted her made her heart sink. The ground was scarred by ATV tracks, and several trees bore fresh marks from climbing gear. Someone had been conducting surveillance of the area, likely tracking the lynx family's movements. The mother lynx appeared briefly at the edge of the clearing, her cubs conspicuously absent. She exchanged a look with Margaret's companion before melting back into the forest. The message was clear. The family had been forced to relocate due to the increased human presence. Returning to her cabin, Margaret found Ranger Sarah waiting for her. The young ranger's face was etched with concern. "We've got trouble," she said without preamble. "The county's received formal complaints about the lynx population. They're calling for population control measures." Margaret's hands clenched into fists. "Population control. These animals aren't a threat. They're intelligent social beings. If anything, they've been protecting people in these mountains." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "I know that, and you know that, but Jack Miller and his supporters have gathered signatures. They're claiming livestock losses. Though we haven't had a single verified incident, they're pushing for official action." As they discussed options, Dr. Wilson arrived with his own news. "The university's interested in conducting a formal study," he explained. "We could document the extraordinary behaviors you've witnessed, provide scientific evidence of the lynx's positive role in the ecosystem." But Margaret felt uneasy about the proposal. And how many more people would that bring into these mountains? How many more disturbances to their habitat? She gestured to the forest. "They're already being forced to hide." The day progressed with a series of meetings and phone calls. Local conservation groups offered support, while others in the community expressed growing concerns about the situation. Margaret found herself at the center of a brewing controversy, with both sides looking to her for answers. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the mountains, Margaret sat on her porch, trying to make sense of it all. The lynx appeared silently, settling beside her chair with an air of quiet solidarity. In the fading light, she could see fresh scratches on its shoulder, evidence of the increasing challenges it faced. "We need to find a way to protect you," she whispered, reaching down to gently touch the animal's fur. The lynx leaned into her touch, a gesture of trust that brought tears to her eyes. This wasn't just about conservation anymore, it was about preserving something miraculous, a bridge between two worlds that most people didn't even believe could exist. A truck engine rumbled in the distance, and the lynx's ears twitched. Before disappearing into the growing darkness, it gave Margaret one last meaningful look. She had learned to read these expressions over their time together, and this one clearly said, "Be prepared." Inside her cabin, Margaret began organizing her evidence: photographs, notes, witness statements from other hikers who had observed the lynx's unusual behavior. She knew she would need every piece of documentation to fight the battle that was coming. As night fell over the mountains, she could hear the lynx's distinctive call echoing through the valley. It wasn't just a signal to its family this time, it was a reminder of what was at stake. The relationship between humans and wildlife was being redefined in these mountains, and Margaret understood that she had been chosen to help guide that transformation. What she didn't know was that the next few days would bring challenges that would test not only her resolve, but the very foundation of everything she believed about the connection between humans and wild creatures. The real battle for the future of these mountains was about to begin. The morning brought a heavy mist that clung to the mountainside, shrouding the forest in an ethereal blanket. Margaret woke to urgent knocking at her door. It was Ethan, his face grave with concern. "They've called an emergency town council meeting," he announced without preamble. "Jack Miller and his group are presenting their case for immediate action against the lynx population. They're claiming public safety concerns." Margaret's heart raced as she quickly dressed and gathered her research materials. The lynx had appeared at her window, its golden eyes reflecting an almost human understanding of the situation. Something in its gaze gave her strength, a reminder that she wasn't fighting this battle alone. The town hall was packed when they arrived. Margaret recognized faces from both sides of the controversy. Local ranchers, conservation activists, curious townspeople, and even a few journalists from regional papers. Dr. Wilson sat near the front, his research papers spread before him. Jack Miller stood at the podium, his voice carrying through the room with practiced authority. "These aren't just ordinary lynx we're dealing with," he declared. "They're showing unusual behavior, getting too comfortable around humans. It's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt." Margaret listened as he presented his case, carefully selected photographs of livestock deterrent measures, economic impact projections, and testimonies from worried parents. It was a masterfully crafted argument that played on people's fears rather than facts. When it was her turn to speak, Margaret approached the podium with determination. The lynx's trust in her had taught her something about courage, about standing firm in the face of opposition. "What we're witnessing in these mountains isn't a threat," she began, her voice steady. "It's an opportunity to understand something extraordinary about the natural world and our place in it." She shared her experiences, carefully omitting the most incredible details that she knew would strain credibility. Instead, she focused on the documented evidence, the lynx's role in maintaining ecological balance, its historical significance in the region, and the tourism potential for responsible wildlife observation. The room buzzed with murmurs as she spoke. Even some of Jack's supporters seemed moved by her passionate defense. "Doctor, Wilson stood to add his scientific perspective, explaining how the unusual behavioral patterns they'd observed could revolutionize our understanding of wild animal intelligence. But just as the tide seemed to be turning, Jack played his final card. "While you've all been debating, something's been happening in these mountains that nobody's talking about," he announced, projecting a series of images on the wall. Margaret's blood ran cold as she recognized the locations. They were near the areas where she'd often seen the Lynx family. The photos showed broken branches, disturbed earth, and what Jack claimed were signs of aggressive territorial marking. "These animals are changing," he insisted. "They're not behaving naturally anymore. And when wild animals stop being wild, that's when accidents happen." The meeting ended without a clear resolution, but Margaret could sense the shift in public opinion. Fear was a powerful motivator, and Jack had wielded it skillfully. As people filed out of the town hall, she overheard snippets of worried conversations about child safety and property values. Outside, the mist had lifted, revealing a sky heavy with approaching storm clouds. The metaphor wasn't lost on Margaret. Something was building, a confluence of forces that would soon require her to take a stand. The lynx was waiting at the edge of the forest when she returned to her cabin. Its presence seemed more determined than ever, as if it too sensed the approaching conflict. Together, they walked into the woods, where Margaret noticed something she hadn't seen before. Subtle signs that the local wildlife was changing its patterns, adapting to the increased human presence in ways that suggested a deeper intelligence at work. As evening approached, bringing with it the first drops of rain, Margaret sat at her desk and began to write. The time had come to reveal everything she knew, to share the full truth about her extraordinary experiences with the lynx. But as she put pen to paper, she realized that the most remarkable chapters of this story were yet to unfold. Thunder rolled across the mountains, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, a lynx called out, not in warning this time, but in what sounded almost like a summons. The real test of the bond between human and wild creature was about to begin, and Margaret knew that what happened next would change not just her life, but the very way people understood their relationship with the natural world. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke over the mountains with spectacular force. As lightning illuminated the forest in stark flashes, Margaret made a discovery that would change everything. While organizing Henry's old research materials, she found a hidden compartment in his desk containing a leather-bound journal she had never seen before. The journal's pages were filled with detailed observations, but these were different from Henry's usual scientific notes. They documented a history of extraordinary interactions between the mountain's lynx population and the indigenous people who had lived there for generations. Henry had spent years interviewing tribal elders, collecting stories that had been passed down through centuries. According to the accounts, certain lynx possessed a rare ability to form deep connections with humans who proved themselves worthy of trust. These weren't just random acts of animal behavior. They were part of an ancient partnership, a sacred bond that helped maintain the balance of the mountain ecosystem. As Margaret read further, her hands trembling with excitement, she found passages that perfectly described her own experiences. The lynx choosing to save a human from danger, the ability to communicate through subtle gestures and expressions, the protective behavior extending to the entire community. It had all happened before. A particularly loud thunderclap made her jump, and when she looked up, she found her lynx companion sitting just outside her window. In the flashes of lightning, its eyes seemed to glow with an ancient wisdom. For the first time, Margaret understood that she hadn't just befriended a remarkably intelligent animal. She had been chosen to continue a tradition that stretched back hundreds of years. The journal revealed more. The indigenous people had believed that these special lynx were guardians of the mountains, possessing an intelligence that went beyond normal animal awareness. They could sense coming dangers, understand complex human emotions, and even coordinate with other wildlife to protect both their territory and the humans they chose to trust. Margaret's mind raced back to all the inexplicable events she had witnessed, the lynx warning them about the landslide, its careful protection of its family, the way it seemed to understand human speech and intentions. Everything made sense now in the context of this ancient knowledge. Just then, her phone rang. It was Dr. Wilson, his voice urgent despite the late hour. "Margaret, you need to see this. We've been analyzing the footage from our wildlife cameras, and there's something extraordinary. The lynx aren't just displaying unusual behavior, they're exhibiting signs of organized social structures we've never seen before in solitary big cats." As he spoke, Margaret's lynx companion became agitated, pawing at her window with increasing urgency. When she opened it, the animal immediately moved to her desk, its nose pointing directly at a map of the mountain range. With deliberate movements, it indicated a specific area, one that Margaret recognized from Henry's journal as an ancient meeting ground. "Dr. Wilson," she interrupted, "I need to show you something. Can you come to my cabin right away? And bring Ranger Sarah if you can reach her. What I've found changes everything we thought we knew about these mountains." While waiting for them to arrive, Margaret continued reading. The journal described how, in times of great change or threat, the lynx would choose human allies to help protect the delicate balance of the mountain ecosystem. These partnerships weren't just about conservation, they were about maintaining a sacred trust between the human and natural worlds. The lynx sat patiently beside her as she read, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed almost like confirmation. Outside, the storm began to ease, and in the distance, she could hear the calls of other lynx, calls that, according to Henry's journal, signaled a gathering of the guardian creatures. When Dr. Wilson and Ranger Sarah arrived, their faces wet from the rain, Margaret could barely contain her excitement. "What I'm about to show you will sound incredible," she began, "but it explains everything we've been witnessing. These mountains hold secrets that have been waiting for the right time to be revealed." As she shared Henry's discoveries, the lynx remained by her side, its presence lending weight to every word. Through the window, more pairs of eyes could be seen gleaming in the darkness. The entire lynx family had gathered, as if understanding the importance of this moment. What none of them realized was that this night would mark the beginning of an even more remarkable chapter in their story. The ancient wisdom contained in Henry's journal was about to become vital in ways none of them could have imagined, as the battle for the mountains entered a new and unprecedented phase. The following morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean. Dr. Wilson sat at Margaret's kitchen table, surrounded by Henry's research materials, his face showing a mixture of wonder and academic excitement. Ranger Sarah stood by the window, watching the unusual gathering of lynx that remained at the forest's edge. "This changes everything," Dr. Wilson said, carefully turning the pages of Henry's hidden journal. The indigenous accounts, the documented patterns of behavior, the generational relationships between specific lynx families and human guardians, it's unprecedented in wildlife science. Margaret watched as her lynx companion moved between them with casual confidence, seemingly aware of its role in this historic revelation. The other lynx, the mother and her cubs, had maintained their distance but remained visible, their presence a testament to the truth of Henry's discoveries. "There's more," Margaret said, pulling out a series of photographs she'd found tucked into the journal's final pages. They showed similar scenes spanning decades, different people, different lynx, but the same extraordinary connection she had experienced. Henry wasn't the first to document this. He was part of a long line of people chosen by the lynx to protect these mountains. Ranger Sarah joined them at the table, her ranger's skepticism warring with what she had witnessed firsthand. "The timing of this discovery isn't coincidental, is it?" she asked, looking pointedly at the lynx. They knew we needed to understand, especially now with the threats they're facing. The lynx met her gaze steadily, its intelligence impossible to dismiss. Then, with deliberate movement, it walked to the cabin door and waited, clearly wanting them to follow. Outside, the morning air was crisp and clean, filled with the sweet scent of rain-washed pine. The animal led them along a path none of them had noticed before, moving with purpose through the underbrush. The other lynx fell into step around them, creating an escort that both protected and guided. After about an hour of hiking, they emerged into a massive clearing that took their breath away. Ancient stone formations created a natural amphitheater with petroglyphs visible on their weathered surfaces. Dr. Wilson rushed forward, his camera already in hand. "These markings," he exclaimed. "They're showing the same relationship we've been witnessing, humans and lynx working together as guardians of the mountain." The scene grew even more remarkable as other wildlife began to appear. Deer stepping cautiously into the clearing, eagles circling overhead, even a young bear watching from a safe distance. The lynx family seemed completely at ease with these potentially dangerous neighbors, suggesting a level of ecosystem cooperation that defied conventional understanding. It's not just about the lynx, Margaret realized, remembering passages from Henry's journal. They're part of a larger network of wildlife that maintains the balance of these mountains. The indigenous people understood this. They saw these relationships as sacred trusts. As if confirming her words, her lynx companion led them to a specific petroglyph. The ancient carving showed a clear representation of a human figure standing beside a lynx, with other animals arranged in a circle around them. Below were symbols that Dr. Wilson identified as representing harmony and protection. "This isn't just a historical site," Ranger Sarah said slowly, her professional demeanor giving way to awe. "It's still active. The lynx are still using it, still maintaining these ancient connections." The morning light seemed to strengthen as they stood there, illuminating the clearing with an almost ethereal glow. The lynx family had arranged themselves near the central stone formation, their poses eerily similar to those depicted in the ancient carvings. Margaret felt tears in her eyes as she understood the full significance of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just about protecting a species or preserving a habitat. It was about maintaining an ancient covenant between humans and nature, a relationship that modern society had all but forgotten. Dr. Wilson was practically vibrating with excitement as he documented everything. This site, these relationships, they prove that wildlife intelligence and behavior are far more complex than we ever imagined. The implications for conservation, for our understanding of animal consciousness. But before he could finish, the lynx suddenly became alert, their ears swiveling toward the forest. The other animals melted away into the undergrowth as the sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the trees. The sacred moment was about to be interrupted by the harsh realities of the modern world. The lynx gathered close to Margaret, their message clear. They had shown her this place for a reason. The ancient trust between humans and wildlife was being threatened, and now she understood exactly what was at stake. The battle for these mountains wasn't just about territory or conservation. It was about preserving a sacred relationship that had helped maintain nature's balance for centuries. The approaching vehicles turned out to be Jack Miller and his supporters, armed with cameras and documentation from the town council. When they burst into the clearing, they stopped short at the unprecedented sight before them. Margaret, Dr. Wilson, and Ranger Sarah, surrounded by the lynx family, standing amid ancient stone formations carved with mysterious symbols. "What in the world?" Jack's voice trailed off as he took in the scene. His usual confidence wavered as he watched the lynx, rather than fleeing from the human intrusion, calmly stand their ground beside Margaret. "Jack." Margaret stepped forward, Henry's journal clutched in her hands. "Before you do anything, there's something you need to see." Her voice carried a new authority, strengthened by the knowledge she now possessed and the trust placed in her by these remarkable creatures. To everyone's amazement, the Lynx family remained in place, their dignified presence impossible to ignore. The mother lynx actually sat down, her cubs arranged around her, presenting a picture of peaceful coexistence that challenged everything Jack and his group believed about wild predators. Dr. Wilson seized the moment to share their discoveries. He explained the significance of the petroglyphs, the generations of documented interactions between humans and lynx, and the complex social behaviors they'd observed. His scientific credibility lent weight to what might otherwise have seemed impossible to believe. These animals aren't just random predators, he explained, gesturing to the ancient carvings. They're part of a sophisticated system of ecological balance that's been in place for centuries. The indigenous people understood this. They saw these lynx as partners in protecting the mountains. As he spoke, something extraordinary happened. Margaret's lynx companion approached Jack slowly, displaying none of the fear or aggression wild animals typically showed toward humans. It stopped a few feet from him, its intelligent eyes meeting his with an unmistakable awareness. Jack's hand, which had been resting on his camera, dropped to his side. "I've been hunting these mountains for 40 years, he said slowly, "but I've never seen anything like this." Ranger Sarah stepped forward, adding her official perspective. "The evidence is undeniable, Jack. These animals aren't a threat to the community. They're actively helping to protect it. The warning about the landslide, the maintenance of prey populations, the prevention of other predators from entering populated areas, they're doing exactly what their ancestors did centuries ago." Margaret opened Henry's journal, showing Jack the detailed observations and historical accounts. "Your concerns about safety aren't wrong," she acknowledged, "but they're based on a misunderstanding. These creatures aren't becoming too comfortable around humans. They're maintaining an ancient partnership that helps keep these mountains in balance." The other members of Jack's group had drawn closer, their faces showing a mixture of wonder and uncertainty as they watched the peaceful interaction between humans and lynx. The cubs, sensing the shifting mood, had begun playing near their mother, demonstrating their natural behavior without fear. "Look at them, Jack," Margaret said softly. "Really look at them. They're not just animals acting on instinct. They're intelligent beings, capable of understanding and cooperation. They've been trying to show us this all along." The morning sun had risen higher, illuminating the clearing and the ancient stones that held centuries of shared history between humans and wildlife. The light seemed to strengthen the mystical quality of the moment, making it impossible to deny the significance of what they were witnessing. Jack Miller, the man who had led the campaign against the lynx, found himself faced with evidence that challenged everything he believed about wild animals. The lynx that had approached him remained nearby, its presence both a challenge and an invitation to understand something profound about the natural world. "All these years," he muttered almost to himself, "we thought we were protecting the mountains by controlling the wildlife. But maybe..." He looked around the clearing, taking in the petroglyphs, the peaceful gathering of normally solitary predators, and the obvious intelligence in their behavior. "Maybe we've been missing something important." As the tension in the clearing began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of wonder and discovery, Margaret realized that this moment represented more than just a victory for the lynx. It was the beginning of a new understanding between humans and wildlife, a chance to restore an ancient balance that had been lost in the modern world. The lynx family, sensing the shift in human attitudes, began to move more freely around the clearing. Their behavior demonstrated exactly what Margaret had been trying to explain. These weren't just wild animals to be feared or controlled, but intelligent beings capable of choosing cooperation over conflict. In the weeks that followed the revelation at the ancient clearing, the atmosphere in the mountain community underwent a remarkable transformation. The town council, presented with the combined evidence of Henry's journal, Dr. Wilson's research, and the undeniable witness accounts voted unanimously to establish a protected sanctuary for the lynx population. Jack Miller, in a surprising turn of events, became one of the strongest advocates for the new sanctuary. His decades of mountain experience, combined with his newfound understanding of the lynx's true nature, made him an invaluable ally in developing guidelines for responsible wildlife interaction. "I've spent my life in these mountains," he told a gathering of local residents, "but I never understood their deepest secrets until now. These creatures aren't our enemies. They're our partners in preserving this land." Margaret watched from her cabin porch as teams of wildlife researchers and conservation experts worked to document and protect the ancient meeting ground. The petroglyphs were carefully preserved, their images telling the story of a relationship between humans and wildlife that stretched back centuries. Dr. Wilson's papers on the lynx's complex social behavior and intelligence had created a sensation in the scientific community. Universities and research institutions were developing new approaches to wildlife studies based on the evidence of sophisticated animal cognition and social structures discovered in the mountains. The lynx family continued their extraordinary behavior, but now they had the freedom to interact with humans on their own terms. The mother began teaching her cubs the ancient ways, just as her ancestors had done for generations. Margaret's special companion remained a constant presence, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Ranger Sarah established educational programs that brought school children to safe observation areas where they could learn about the lynx and their role in maintaining the mountain's ecosystem. The children's natural openness to wonder made them perfect recipients of this ancient wisdom. "Look at their eyes," one young student whispered during a visit, watching the lynx family from a respectful distance. "They're not just looking at us, they're seeing us." Margaret found herself becoming a bridge between two worlds, helping humans understand the complex intelligence of these remarkable creatures, while ensuring the lynx's ancient ways were protected and preserved. The journal Henry had left behind became a guide for future generations, its pages filled with wisdom that was more relevant now than ever. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Margaret sat in her familiar spot on the porch. Her lynx companion lay nearby, both of them watching the mother lynx teaching her growing cubs the skills they would need to continue their species' legacy. "We almost lost something precious," Margaret reflected, speaking softly to her feline friend. "Something that took centuries to build." The lynx's gentle rumble of response seemed to carry understanding and agreement. The mountains had changed her, just as she had helped change the way people saw these mountains. The silence that had once felt empty after Henry's departure now felt full of life and meaning. She had found not just purpose, but a connection to something ancient and profound, a partnership between humans and nature that offered hope for the future. As darkness settled over the valley, the lynx family gathered in the yard, their presence a testimony to trust and understanding. The cubs played in the twilight while their mother watched proudly. Margaret's companion rose and moved to join them, pausing to give her one last look, a look that spoke of friendship, trust, and a shared mission to protect the delicate balance of life in these ancient mountains. High above, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the same stars that had watched over countless generations of humans and lynx working together as guardians of this sacred land. The mountain wind carried the sound of the lynx family's calls, not cries of wild animals, but songs of ancient wisdom, promising that as long as there were those willing to listen and understand, the remarkable partnership between humans and wildlife would continue. Dear listeners, we hope this extraordinary tale of Margaret and her remarkable bond with the mountain lynx has touched your hearts. This story reminds us that the natural world holds mysteries and wisdom far deeper than we imagine. To continue this journey of discovery, we've prepared a special playlist featuring similarly inspiring stories about the incredible connections between humans and wildlife. Find it by clicking the link to your left. If this story moved you, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the profound mysteries of life and nature. Share your own experiences with wildlife in the comments below. We believe every story of connection with nature helps build a bridge between our world and the wild. See you in our next adventure.